Good evening, everyone. I'm Andrew Waterhouse, Director of the Robert Mondavi Institute. It's my privilege to welcome you to the 20th Walt Klenz Lecture. Thank you for coming this evening. The Robert Mondavi Institute was created to provide a forum for exchange of ideas in food and wine, and it's focused on bringing that discussion to the public. So the Klenz Lecture is very much part of our mission to enhance the public understanding of wine and food science. So please use the Q&A tool to pose your questions, and after the lecture, we will get to as many as possible. This evening's topic highlights an issue of great interest in wine business, the rapid growth and interest in natural wine. Our speaker is one of the innovators in that sector of the market. Our speaker will be introduced by Mr. Klenz, so I'd like to say a few words first about the lecture series. The series was established in 2005 through a pledge originally made by Beringer Blast Wine Estates to honor CEO Walt Klenz upon his retirement. The endowment supports lectures hosted by the Institute and sponsored by Treasury Wine Estates. The series brings world-famous winemakers and other professionals to the UC Davis campus community and student body to share their unique perspective, insights, and experiences in wine business. Mr. Walt Klenz got his bachelor's and MBA from Tulane University. He held a number of senior marketing, finance, and operations appointments at Beringer until his appointment in 1990 as president. While he is currently retired, he remains active in the wine industry today as a board member of a number of organizations. Among other accomplishments, he is the past president of Napa Valley Vintners and a past chairman of the Wine Institute. Walt, welcome.
Thank you, Andy. I really appreciate your kind words, and I can't believe it's 15 years and or more than 15 years and over 20 presentations. It's been a long, wonderful journey, and I want to take the opportunity, as I always try to do, to thank you, Babette, and all the staff at the Robert Mondavi Institute for your support of this lecture series. You do a fabulous job. I also wanted to reach out and thank all our Zoomers zooming in today to listen to this what's going to be a really interesting lecture. So thank you all for coming in. And what I'm really here to do is to introduce our guest speaker. I'm very pleased to introduce this evening's special speaker, Martha Stoumen. Martha is a leading and passionate voice for natural wines in California. And Martha, thank you very much for taking the time out of your schedule and agreeing to do this lecture this evening. I really appreciate that. After college, Martha began a long global journey to study natural winemaking, traveling to Europe for several years, working with leading winemakers and growers in Italy, France, and Germany. She returned to California in 2010 to earn her master's in viticulture and enology at, you won't be surprised to hear, at UC Davis. She then resumed her global travels for a couple more years, working in such leading wine regions as Sicily and New Zealand. Martha returned to California in 2014 and started her own winery and brand, Martha Stoumen Wines. Martha's winery is now based in Sebastopol in Sonoma County, which is her original home, where she produces a wide range of natural wines, working with local growers who share her belief in minimal intervention in the vineyard as well as in the winery itself. So, to share her insights into this exciting and emerging wine category, natural wines, I am very pleased to introduce Martha Stoumen.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Walt. Thank you, Dr. Waterhouse. I'm so excited to be here and feel very honored to be the 20th speaker in this wonderful lecture series. So without further ado, I'm gonna go ahead and get started here. So in thinking about this talk, I was curious, there were a few threads of where to start, but I ended up starting with this statement here. The synopsis introducing the speaker series states that sales trends of natural wine are notoriously hard to track because of its unclear definition. The few times the greater wine industry has commented on the natural wine movement, it's still a small movement, the lack of a unifying definition seems to be what is mentioned the most, I've found. But I don't totally buy that it's the lack of definition that is stopping us from tracking natural wine sales. True, while there is no international governing body for natural wine, and therefore no single entity that can tell us what the agreed upon definition of natural wine is, I've read article after article giving definitions to natural wine that tend to have deeply overlapping language. This language usually comes from those who are working within the natural wine industry, those who either make, sell, or write about natural wine. Little side note, while not international and currently undergoing a 3-year trial period, in France, the 2020 Natural Wines Union was created in collaboration with the French Ministry of Agriculture. So this created the first government recognized definition of the term. But I'd argue that the true reason we can't quantify the sales trends of natural wine is because the industry at large hasn't cared to collect this data yet. There are plenty of polls that collect self-reported data, and those currently making, selling, and writing about natural wine seem to be quite clear about what they are doing. So I think that natural wine sales data collection could be possible even today. I want to talk about the natural foods business for a minute because its early days looked much like the early days of the natural wine movement. First, let's ask, was there a unifying definition of natural foods in the early natural foods movement? In natural foods, there had been 3 ingredients that it was forbidden to use or sell by common unwritten consensus: sugar, meat, and highly refined products. I want to emphasize this was by unwritten consensus among those involved in the natural foods industry in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and early 90s. Additionally, there were those who operated in the natural food space who, contrary to the definition above, did sell meat and who were also considered some of natural foods' most fervent players. In 1977, Mrs. Gooch's has the grand opening of her first one-stop natural food supermarket in Los Angeles. This store was considered one-stop because, unlike most other natural food stores, it carried meat. Gooch's rules, no sugar, white flour, chocolate, or coffee, were so stringent that any product she approved of became known as Goochable and set a standard for the entire natural foods industry. So no, there wasn't a clear black and white definition of natural foods, but everyone involved at the time seemed to know what they were doing and how they would identify their businesses. And there were sales stats. So what did sales of natural foods look like in the US in the early days? Between 1968 and 1973, sales of natural foods in the US multiplied tenfold, from 60 million to almost 600 million. And I looked it up. 600 million in today's money is $3.8 billion. There was a whole slew of natural grocers and distributors popping up all over the country in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Below, I choose to highlight 2 of the most successful examples, but many others benefited financially from the growth in natural foods. In 1976, UNFI, the largest publicly traded wholesale distributor of health and specialty food in the United States and Canada, was started out by founder Michael Funk's VW van. In 1978, 2 of the original 4 owners of what would become Whole Foods Market borrowed $45,000 from friends and family and founded a natural foods store called Saferway, which was a spoof on Safeway. They lived in the store and showered by using the dishwasher hose. So I've always wondered, for what was a rapidly growing sector in the food industry, why are so many of the largest companies within natural foods today those that helped start it? Why didn't more established food distributors and grocery stores at the time jump in? I don't imagine it was for lack of capital. I don't imagine it was lack of capital stopping them from making a $45K investment in an industry grossing 600 million. I can only speculate, and I think the picture of Michael Funk in the top right backs me up here. But is it perhaps because the US natural foods movement was founded by a bunch of young hippies that nobody in the industry really took them seriously? And that makes me wonder, does everyone in the wine industry think us natural winemakers are just a bunch of hippies? Is this why we don't have data on natural wine sales yet? I mean, clearly hippies can make great business people. All joking aside here, I wanted to discuss natural foods because the natural foods movement and the natural wine movement at their core are cut from very similar cloth. Both are a reaction to high input chemical farming. Both are trying to get away from highly processed consumables. Being food, the natural foods movement had a deep nutritional component to it as well. For natural wine, I think this shows up more as transparency. So while the TTB does impose legal limits on total sulfites and creates the list of materials authorized for the treatment of wine and juice, there is no governing body in the US that forces a producer to disclose what materials they have used in wine, if within the TTB parameters, except sulfites and not the quantity. Because the natural wine movement was born out of a reaction to highly processed wine, elective transparency is of course a core value. As a side note, some export countries do make you disclose the use of certain processing aids that contain potential allergen proteins like egg white and lysozyme. The other comment I've heard from many voices in the wine industry is that natural wine is a fad. By definition, fads come and go. And although it evolved, the natural foods industry was clearly not just a fad. I think the natural wine industry may want to consider natural wine more of a legitimate sector than it has, which is great. I mean, that's why I'm doing this lecture. Although I'm also totally fine with bigger wine companies ignoring us for a while longer. Let us get our footing a little bit more. To finish out this section, here's a common definition of natural wine. Natural wines come from grapes and sometimes other fruits that are at minimum farmed according to organic practices, whether or not they're certified. Natural wines are fermented with native yeast and bacteria and without additions and processing aids. Natural wines have not been sterile filtered, some say filtered at all, and are preserved with low to no added sulfites. Is this definition black and white? Absolutely not. And I think it's a good thing it's not, because viticulture, winemaking, and wine itself are never black and white. And the natural wine movement is all about showcasing the colorful character of nature. On occasion, I, like Mrs. Gooch, have operated outside of this commonly accepted definition, but remain dedicated to the natural wine movement. For instance, while I've never used commercial yeast or bacteria for our wines, even on the rare stuck fermentation, there have been a few occasions where I've chosen to sterile filter a portion of a wine that was microbially going sideways. I found this choice to be less intervention than adding a high level of sulfur dioxide that would have been needed to save the wine, and more preserving of terroir than letting mouse taint take over the wine. So there are no black and whites, but this is why transparency is that much more important. I'm going to shift gears and begin talking about what I really came here to discuss, which is what it's been like to build a natural wine business. First, though, I'd like to give you a little background on myself. And Walt did such a good job, I'm not going to go through all of this by any means, but some highlights. I am a first-generation winemaker and grape grower based in Northern California. I grew up outside of Sebastopol, and I've always been interested in food. As Walt mentioned, my first exposure to winemaking was in 2006 at a full circle Tuscan farm and learning center where I apprenticed when I was 22. And for me, I really loved the tactile and completely immersive experience that winemaking and the grape harvest provided. So I decided to dedicate myself to it. I apprenticed for many, many years, as Walt mentioned. And from my undergraduate degree at UCLA, I came to winemaking with a foundation in environmental studies and a deep appreciation for organic and regenerative farming. Then in 2007, I became interested in native or wild yeast fermentations. And in 2010, started drinking and making natural wines, which married all of these principles together. I founded Martha Stoumen Wines in 2014, as Walt mentioned, to help establish a natural winemaking presence in California. So on to the business. When I started Martha Stoumen Wines in 2014, I really started it out of what I saw as necessity. After I started working in wine production, I saw firsthand how destructive commercial grape growing can be to our soils and ecology when yields is the only consideration. And I'm flat out opposed to this type of farming. I also witnessed how wine, which is marketed as a product with a sense of place, deep ties to the earth, and born from cultural traditions, had become a formulated product with a good number of processing aids and additives other than grapes. Large-scale industrial wine is meant to be consistent year after year above all else. And while I don't think there's anything wrong with having formulated wine on the market by any means, I do think the traditional craft of winemaking is something worth preserving, and that consumers might want to know what type of product they're getting. I'd been working in the natural wine industry abroad, and when I returned home to Northern California, I knew it was what I wanted to make. There was a problem though, a couple in fact. Firstly, there were so few Californian producers making natural wine, and those that were so teeny that they couldn't afford to hire anyone. Well, becoming a business owner wasn't my dream. Making natural wine was. So I decided to start my own label. Then came the second problem, money. I'd been working since I was 14 and financially on my own since I was 18, but student loan debt and an 8-year apprenticeship period that sometimes paid, but mostly didn't exactly leave me with money to start a very capital intensive business in a very expensive state. So I started the business by making wine on nights and weekends in my friend's parents' basement, which we actually got legally bonded as a winery, surprisingly. I was doing that while working full-time as an assistant winemaker for one of those very few natural wine producers who could afford to pay someone something. And I also filled shifts at a local natural wine bar. As you can see here, from Martha Stoumen Wines, I wore a whole lot of hats in the beginning. After 3 vintages, I had enough wine to sell, and in 2017, I had my first release. At the end of 2017, I raised a small amount of investment by selling off 18% of the business, and I gained 3 great advisors in the process. With that investment, I was able to make more wine and started working solely for myself. My goal was to reinvest the maximum amount I could every year back into the business, and I adjusted my life to do that. I moved into a shared house in Berkeley with affordable rent and very affordable shared meals, kind of like an adult co-op. My boyfriend, who would later become my husband, moved into my room there and lessened my rent even more. And I have to say, we had some of our best memories living in that house. Besides being frugal in my personal life, I had worked in some pretty modest cellars and knew that great wine could be made with few means, as long as the grapes were good. So I really kept it simple. I invested in some very used equipment and focused on sourcing excellent fruit, both from established grape growers and by reviving abandoned vineyards that had good bones. And I've always worked out of shared winery spaces, which keeps costs low and keeps me connected to my community. If you're wondering what's going on in the photo to the right, that's my friend's parents' basement. It was a large basement. We hung a water pipe from the ceiling that went out that window, which was at ground level outside. And we pitchforked the grapes into the water pipe to get them down into the basement. Here I am using a hand crank destemmer after the small electric destemmer that we rented broke. We fermented in a picking bin. That was kind of the state of affairs, vintage one in 2014. And while we're on this slide, I just want to give a shout out to everyone who lent a hand in those early years, even for an hour here or there. In 2017, one volunteer ended up staying 8 hours after he had planned to until 4 a.m. when our destemmer needed to be pulled apart every 20 minutes and restarted. So thank you, Aaron Maddox. And yeah, the destemmer in 2017 was a different but equally old destemmer to the one in 2014. So what does the business look like today? 2022 marks our 9th year of business and 9th harvest, and my 19th harvest personally. While I'm not still working multiple jobs, at least outside the business, we're still a small business. We have chosen to grow slowly by modern wine industry standards, as we didn't take on large initial investment nor do we buy wine on the bulk market. We only make what we sell. On the other hand, for the natural wine world, we are mid-sized and currently produce around 9,000 cases a year. Martha Stoumen Wines has 5 employees and is growing. So shameless plug, we're hiring and we'll continue posting positions over the next 6 months. We are majority women owned and currently majority women operated as well. We do try to hire across the board. Tim, our assistant winemaker and my first employee, is pictured here with me. As Walt mentioned, wine is based out of a cooperative winemaking space in Sebastopol, California, and vineyards are located throughout Northern California, with the majority in Mendocino County. We sell our wines through a network of independent distributors across 34 states and 10 countries. We also sell wine through our online direct-to-consumer channel, the heart of which is our community-supported wine club. We intentionally don't have a tasting room at this stage of business. So our digital presence is the pillar of our hospitality and is supported by caring customer service, occasional events, pop-ups, collaborations, and thoughtful art-forward club collateral. All of our press so far has been organic, non-paid press. And today we have access to a much nicer destemmer than we did in the past. So someone recently asked me, as a first-generation winemaker, what are some of the challenges faced and lessons learned in building your own company? Well, this question doesn't apply just to natural wine. Many of the natural wine producers in California are first generation. For me, the biggest challenge and the biggest freedom of being a first-generation winemaker is that you're building everything from scratch. Every decision, big or small, is in your hands. You have to constantly strive to strike a balance between thoughtfully weighing options and quickly making choices. I continue to work on this. But how do you start making decisions in the first place? I really think of building a business much like planting a vineyard. The early upstream decisions you make will determine your future, and planning is key. Do you want your vineyard to be dry farmed? That is a key decision from which all other decisions you make will be based. If dry farming is your North Star, then you've already inadvertently limited your decisions regarding rootstock choice, your future farming practices, and your yields, so therefore your final bottle pricing. I am calling these limited decisions downstream decisions. So it's very difficult to convert a vineyard to dry farming that was designed to be irrigated. I find a business to be the same in my limited experience. It's much harder to make a big pivot once a business has been established under a different vision. One more note here though, when going through this process of building a roadmap and determining which decisions are contingent on others, it's also important to determine what truly are the downstream decisions. We inherit a lot of information that has simply become the wine industry status quo. So understanding what is best practice and what has simply been done is an important exercise. For me, choosing to make natural wine and to be transparent about my process provided me with the upstream decisions that would become my roadmap. So let's dissect some of those decisions for a natural wine business and how I've interpreted them. And how have these early decisions I've made fared over the past 8 years. We'll start in the vineyard. Our general farming philosophy is to work with nature. We enrich our soils with compost and allow beneficial insects to outcompete pests. We welcome plant growth below our vines before they are mowed or cultivated under. Plants serve as insect habitat in the spring and organic matter in the fall. We harvest and prune by hand to ensure healthy grapes arrive at the winery and long-lived vines remain in the fields. When I was looking to establish a vineyard that was all about reducing vineyard inputs, the first question I asked was, what disease pressure needs to be treated the most in vineyards? If you're in California and you've gone to school for viticulture or worked in the vineyard year-round, you know the answer: powdery mildew. And no, this is a worldwide problem, but other diseases like downy mildew are also problematic in other areas of the world. So when I first started the business in 2014, California coastal land was very popular, including the land outside of Sebastopol where I grew up, which is now the heart of Pinot country. Knowing how competitive access to this land was, I wondered what less fashionable areas could also make great wine. Despite this, in 2014, A neighbor of my parents asked me if I'd take over farming their small Pinot vineyard in exchange for the grapes that harvest. It was a great way for me to gain access to grapes for very little cash outlay, and I agreed. That year, I was putting most of my cash towards purchasing Neradavla and Old Vine Carignan from the Ukiah Valley area in Mendocino. So that spring, in the Sebastopol Pinot Vineyard, I applied 14 applications of fungicides and did 4 different canopy management passes to keep UV light and airflow high. I spot treated any mildew outbreaks and dropped fruit. I actually removed it from the vineyard. I was so paranoid when infections did pop up. So, although I was using fungicides approved for organic farming, this still felt high intervention to me. Plus, when I was dedicated to natural winemaking, which called for fermenting grapes just as they were. And I only ended up making rosé from that Pinot vineyard because the grape skins were never healthy enough to make red. Meanwhile, the Neradavla and the Carignan vineyards to the north had been treated twice in the spring with elemental sulfur dust only, and had passed through once to sucker. They made excellent red wine that year. I was thinking about what one of my winemaking mentors, Giusto from Sicily, had told me. He said, "You'd be crazy to not farm organically here in Sicily. We have ample sun, warm weather, and good aeration from the wind coming off the Mediterranean." Davis had taught me that powdery mildew thrives best in temperatures between 68 and 77. I hope I'm getting that right. It's been a while since I've been there. Basically, West Sebastopol wasn't just an ideal place for me to grow up. It was perfect for powdery mildew too. And it was planted to Pinot Noir, one of the most susceptible grape varieties. So maybe it makes great wine, but at a cost I wasn't interested in pursuing. So while it was unfashionable in California in the wine industry to look inland, I specifically wanted to work in warmer areas of California that naturally have less disease pressure. So this became an upstream decision for me. I still wanted to make elegant and stable wines without winery additions, however. So the downstream decision became, what grape varieties can I work with that maintain good acidity and a lower pH in hot climates? And many of those fall into the Mediterranean category. I was particularly excited about Neradavla, a grape I had worked with in Sicily, which had great acidity and medium tannins. Tannins are also important for natural winemaking stability, or any winemaking stability. Neradavla has also has a loose cluster, which would make it even less susceptible to disease. And I forgot to mention it's delicious. Another early decision I made in the vineyard was to work with mostly dry farmed head trained vineyards. When we planted out additional vines in our lease vineyard, Bricarelli Ranch, you can see here we established rootstocks for 1 to 2 years before field grafting mass selection material, as many traditional dry farm vineyards are established. I assumed we would be farming these new blocks more like 5 to 7 years before harvesting the crop, rather than the 3 years bench grafted irrigated vineyards need to produce fruit. This is accounted for in my business model and means that expansion happens more slowly for us. But the trade-off we're betting on is that these vineyards will be more resilient long-term. Speaking of long-term, I loved the fruit off of older vineyards I'd worked with in the south of France. At Lyon Barral, an important natural winery making traditional wines in Fougères, the winemaker Didier chose to destem the younger vineyard's fruit, as the wine chemistry from those vineyards was a little less stable. Old vine fruit was fermented whole cluster. So yet another upstream decision presented itself, the desire to work with older vines because it would likely result in more stable, balanced wine in the cellar when made naturally. Again, I find exceptions to this rule all the time, but some of my best fruit does come from vines over 70 years old. And there's something deeper at play here too. Early on in this talk, I mentioned that wine is marketed as a product with a sense of place, deep ties to the earth, and born from cultural traditions. This is perhaps one of the strongest cultural traditions we can work to preserve, which is honoring the generationality of vineyards and the work of those who came before us. The fact that I get to make wines from vines that were planted and cared for by someone who has since passed away, honestly, feels amazing. It's like a gift. But planning for and caring for older vine vineyards means pruning by hand and often leaving longer spurs for dieback, which then have to be removed the following year. This means additional cuts and additional labor, but also prevents wood diseases that often limit vine age. So I could talk for hours about what viticulture decisions we've weighed while building the foundation of our business, but I still have a lot I'd like to get to tonight. Briefly, I'll sum up a bird's eye view of viticulture at Martha Stoumen Wines. Our focus is on varieties that need few farming inputs and produce fresh and balanced wine despite California's warm climate, so mostly Mediterranean, but that may mean some historic to early California viticulture as well. Currently we lease 2 vineyards and have 13 contract vineyards. The vineyards we work with are primarily in Mendocino County, but also Contra Costa County and Sassoon Valley. 98% of our vineyards are practicing or certified organic. We do have 1 vineyard that is not organically farmed because synthetic fungicides are applied, which we've decided is the lowest impact solution for this particular site. At this site, compost teas are also applied to build up soil microbial health, and undervine plants provide insect habitat. This vineyard is also a repository for historic vine material, and the grower has just started experimenting with hybrids as well. It's a really cool vineyard. I'll keep repeating myself. There are no black and whites in this industry, which is why transparency is so important. 72% of our vineyards are dry farmed, and the majority are also old vine. So let's move on to discuss what the business of natural wine looks like in the cellar a little bit. We work with a light hand in the cellar. Native yeast and bacteria present on the grape skins perform primary and secondary fermentation. And yes, all of our wines go through malolactic, white and rosés too. Rather than adding tannin, acidity, or stabilizing agents, we work with the tannin and acids naturally found in our fruit. And we monitor our wines carefully during aging so we can avoid high sulfite levels. Free and total sulfur dioxide, sulfur is our only addition, is listed on our wines tech sheet and is available for all to see on our website. Again, when we're discussing winemaking, I want to emphasize that the choice to make natural wine is a philosophical one rather than an environmental choice, like I believe viticulture is. When I was living in Italy, I remember witnessing 2 men arguing over which of their villages baked a better loaf of bread. While I'm not weighing in on which loaf was better, the point is they were regionally different, even just from village to village. And those men were proud of where they came from. I feel very similarly about the decision to make natural wine in California. I have immense pride in my home, and making natural wine is a way for me to show others what unique beauty can come from this land. So, excuse me, we let the base material, the grapes, guide our winemaking each year. No recipes or formula, just the best wine we can make from that harvest. In fact, we want to showcase the diversity of nature. While I believe natural winemaking can produce higher highs, it can also result in lower lows. While I think the risk of making natural wine is overblown, it is important to understand that there are risks involved, an assessment any business will make. So there are the obvious lows. Those wine faults we learn about when drinking wine, like volatile acidity, Brett, mouse taint, if you're drinking natural wine, to name a few. For many of those, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. I think VA makes some wines taste better. Other times it turns my stomach. Brett, depends how much. Mouse taint, not my jam, although I have a friend who likes it, and I know many less sensitive individuals because of their body chemistry. But besides those obvious lows, I think there are other more kind of mild lows to consider, like perhaps a wine from a particular vineyard in a particular vintage still had unripe flavors in the skins when the acidity and sugar levels seem to be just right. Because I wouldn't be adjusting juice chemistry with additions or processing aids in the cellar, I knew I needed to build a different kind of consumer-facing wine business as well. So the first step in mitigating these possible lows is to try to prevent them from happening in the first place, obviously. Prevent them in the vineyard from, getting unbalanced fruit, or prevent them in the cellar just by careful monitoring and a lot of experience. But I do believe that the grape has everything it needs to make wine. I feel very grateful and thankful that I took so long to train before learning and learn before starting my own business. And believe me, we still make mistakes in the cellar. But when I started Martha Stoumen Wines, the most well-regarded wines in the market were generally single vineyard, single varietal wines from the most popular varietals only. Some California wineries also produce blends, but generally those only blends that fell in line with classic AOC traditions, like Bordeaux style blends, for instance. By making natural wines, I knew I was restricting my winemaking toolbox. If I was restricting one area, I felt like I needed to open up another. So I purposefully built a brand that would allow for a wider range of wine styles, varietals, and blends. Equally as important in my decision to embrace a wider range of wine styles, varietals, and blends was I wanted room to experiment. Creativity in the cellar is really my biggest joy, and joy should not be overlooked when you're building the foundation of your company. Plus, I wanted to discover what other faces of California could look like. So when I explained my plan to a few people more experienced than I myself in the industry about what sort of business I was going to run, they were skeptical that I'd be able to sell these type of wines. The reasons they cited: no one has heard of these grapes, too much education needs to happen before people will buy a cloudy, unfiltered wine, the list goes on. While I think this could have been true if I were to try and sell my wines through one of the few massive distributors in the US, I really expected the natural wine movement to grow across all tiers of the wine industry, not just production. I believed consumers would be excited to try something they had never tasted. And that educational piece, there was a growing number of distributors, retailers, and restaurants selling natural wine who were as passionate about this type of education as I was. It turns out consumers were more than ready to learn and explore. And as long as I was going against the norm, in 2018, during my second year of sales, I priced an aged Rosado, essentially a rosé, which I was aging, which was also weird, as my most expensive wine. Why? Because it was my most expensive wine to make, and I thought it was my best. I bring this up because I really think it's important to build your business around what your reality is. And reality only keeps getting more real. I have a section here about climate change and flexibility that I'm going to skip through because I'm running a little short on time, but essentially a lot of those early decisions I made about flexibility have really ended up faring well over the years. Of course, there are, working up in Mendocino where it's already warm climate and things are getting hotter provides challenges. And I think I'll still see a lot of challenges due to climate change, but a lot of the early decisions I made, I would still make today when considering climate resistance. So what does a flexible, creatively driven wine lineup actually look like in practice? All this loads. In 2021, we made 21 wines, which is a lot for a small business of 900 cases or 9,000 cases. Some cuvées we made only 70 cases, some 3,500 cases, like our post-sortation red. Because of the creative freedom we've allowed ourselves, our portfolio is ever changing. So even among wines in this core lineup section. We value creativity in all of the aspects of the business and work with different artists for our label artwork, including our core artist, Oakland-based mixed media paper artist, Carolyn Haydu. And we welcome creativity in the winery, which can mean a whole bunch of things. I've talked about this a little bit, but I'm going to give some examples. It may mean collaborating with another winemaker or food-based artist, like we did, excuse me, with Julia Sherman to make Juju, which is a low ABV sparkling Verjus. Often it means letting the grapes lead the way. So in 2017, this is how our Neradabla and Negro Mar Rosados were born. When they were ripe that year, both lots came in with very low pHs. So I decided to make a rosé, and I decided to foot tread them and leave them on their stems overnight because stem contact can really shift pH upward. By crafting wines that reflect the ingredients of the season, I feel unencumbered by some idea of what a wine should be. Creativity can also mean solving a problem, like with the creation of our one-off Muscatel dessert wine. In spring of 2019, our winery flooded, and we were unable to go into the building for weeks to top up our wines while the flood remediation crew was working to do the cleanup. While no wine and flood water were ever mixed, thankfully, one of our tanks was left in a room that was flash heated during the cleanup process and went mousy. We asked our distillery neighbors if we could make brandy from it, and they agreed, splitting the distillate with us. Later that harvest, we added fresh orange muscat juice to the brandy and made a delicious fortified dessert wine. Our newest creative effort, called Try It Out, is a wine spritzer that was born out of need and desire. Our need was climate resilience for our business. My desire, I'd been dreaming of making a lower alcohol, subtle wine spritzer derived from completely natural and elemental ingredients for a little while. But this creative desire didn't really feel urgent. Then in 2020, when we faced our largest wildfire year to date, we realized we needed a product more immune to smoke taint than our long élevage, more macerated red wines were. A lot of wineries face this. That low ABV spritzer that I'd been daydreaming about, in theory, was something that could be made from essentially any direct pressed grapes, white or red. I thought this could come in very handy in a heavily smoky year when fermenting on the skins was not a risk we were willing to take. And remember, we don't do a lot of things in the winery. So even though tools to clean up smoke taint are currently still quite limited, technology is quite limited, we're learning more about it, we don't engage with that. So we had to kind of come up with a more, an alternative route to deal with this. So in 2021, the daydream became a reality, and we quite literally called it Try It Out, because that's what we're doing, trying something out. We'll go on making the red wines that I love so much in years when we can, but in years when we can't, I hope the spritzer will smooth out the cash flow interruptions that climate change will continue to throw our way. So finally, at your table, our goal is to create wine that is vibrant and uplifting. Some of the wines we make, I recommend with food, others could go with or without. Ultimately though, when I started Martha Stoumen Wines, I wanted to break down some of the more rigid, somewhat elitist wine culture in this country. I wanted to create a bigger tent. So I really want our wines to meet the drinker wherever they are. Wine culture at its core should really just be about sharing pleasure. Before investing in a new website in December of 2020, we ran a customer survey and found that, among other things, our customers span a wide range of ages. In his most recent State of the U.S. Wine Industry report, Rob McMillan sounds an alarm bell for the wine industry. It's one that he's outlined in previous reports as well. And that is, boomers are retiring and younger consumers are not as interested in wine. Eric Asimov of the New York Times wrote an article about this report that really resonated with me. First, Asimov agrees that this report spoke to a lot of the real issues the greater wine industry is facing. But when it comes to the report's suggestion to produce a got milk type marketing campaign as a way to engage younger consumers, despite loving those commercials when I was younger, I have to side with Asimov on this one. He writes, I don't know much about marketing, but it strikes me that actual change in the industry could go a lot further in appealing to young people than targeting them with a public relations campaign. He goes on, in my little corner of the wine world, I see younger people drawn to natural wines and to traditional styles. These sorts of wines meet many of the concerns that Mr. McMillan expressed and have demonstrated their appeal. The winemakers do this by showing their concern with the environment by farming conscientiously, sticking with traditional ingredients and processes, and increasingly, I hope, by addressing social justice and equity issues that are as apparent in natural wine as anywhere else. It's not just a question of perception, it's a matter of action, of demonstrating a commitment to change and making the effort. Slogans will not paper over a failure to do that. So that's all I have time for tonight. Thank you again for joining me. I think we have a little time for some Q&A now.
Well, thank you very much, Martha. That was a fun ride.
I know it's an interesting topic to talk about, you know, without trying to be polarizing, because the idea at the end of the day is that it is supposed to be a bigger tent.
Yes, and I'm glad that, by the way, I am now, okay, your age range doesn't include some people I happen to know are consumers that are my age.
Well, this was a while ago, you know, December 2020.
All right, so this is, I think, a question you started to answer in a way, but it has to do with how will climate change affect your business? Because obviously, I mean, what I could see of dry farmed vineyards, as you know, we're facing this historic drought. Does that really put your business at jeopardy? You know, what are you thinking about how you're going to deal with this issue?
Yeah, I mean, the section I skipped over, I say very plainly that it's really one of the most stressful parts of my job. I mean, climate change, it's something. I studied environmental studies and you know, knew that this has been coming down the pipeline, but I still honestly feel caught off guard by how quickly it's impacted the wine industry and California viticulture. You know, in 2014 was thinking more about like, how can I help prevent this rather than mitigation? And I think we're really certainly need to work on prevention as well, but we're more at the mitigation stage than anything else. And dry farming, it is more of a yo-yo with yields, certainly, and yields were definitely down in 2021, this most recent, you know, very extreme drought year. But I also saw the opposite happening where, you know, nearby vineyards were either ag water was completely cut off, or there were no reservoirs. You know, the reservoirs in each vineyard, private reservoirs, were dry. So water was a really, really big issue. And I think for those that were not, the vineyards that have not traditionally been dry farmed, actually really, I saw suffer a lot. Their canopies looked a lot worse than the dry farm vineyards I saw that already have deep root structures that are already on really drought tolerant rootstock. So I don't have an answer for this. It's going to suck for everyone, really. I mean, I don't know how else to put it, but I think dry farming is still kind of the better choice of the two.
Here's a completely different type of question.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts about the younger generation, I guess that would mean you, moving away from drinking alcohol?
Yeah, this is something I promised I would never admit on air, but I actually don't drink that much either. And here I am making wine, and I don't know. I wonder if the wine industry is going to have to kind of come to a little bit of a reckoning with this. Then again, I wonder, you know, am I not drinking wine right now because I'm at home with a stressful 2-year-old and don't see any of my friends. So who knows? I mean, I think we're still, it's a trend that started a little bit before the pandemic, but is it something that the pendulum is going to swing back on or not? I don't know the answer to, but I mean, at the end of the day, hopefully small businesses can thrive and we're not making as much wine, and hopefully there's still going to be those people out there who want to drink it.
Yeah. Here's a basic question. Do you sell mostly through distribution network or direct?
Yeah, so by a dollar value, I sell about 2/3 of my wine through distribution, which if you're accounting for, have to do the math on the fly, but if you're accounting for, selling at distribution at about 48% of retail price versus, I don't know, maybe we capture 70% of retail price after our cost to market direct to consumer. You're talking about a lot more volume through distribution, yes.
Okay, here's a very technical question. I think this must be a wine student here. Have you tested what yeast varieties you have besides Saccharomyces?
I have not. I have a friend who works for Oxford Nanopore, and his company prior to COVID was they were coming up with like a quick genomic sequencing tool for mostly, that certain applications. Gut biome is a big thing they're working on, soil microbiome. And he said, oh, do you want to, we'll send you a bunch of dry ice and you can freeze dry samples, every 12 hours of a fermentation. And he did the whole sequence. But I have yet to make tails or, heads or tails of it because COVID hit and then they started working on the vaccine. So.
All right. So here's a more, I don't know what sure the answer might this be, but what's your ideal picking decision in terms of pH, Brix, and TA?
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and say I always taste and I don't make wine by the numbers, but I really do like to see wines come in, especially anything that I'm going to ferment whole cluster. If reds come in, my Neradavla comes in around 3.4 pH, sometimes even lower, which is quite low for red wine. But for me, it's just, you really do have to consider, I guess, the laws of the world when you're making natural wine. And really, if I see something high pH, occasionally I've let it age on its own, just, if it's a small lot as an experiment, but mostly I try to blend it into something that's lower pH right away. So I'm always monitoring pH, especially post fermentation, so we can keep bacterial infections low.
Okay. So here's a philosophical question. What would you say is the biggest challenge to remaining a natural winery?
This is something my husband often asks me. He's like, well, could you ever be a big production winery if you're making natural wine? And, because California, there are economic factors. I mean, granted, I love, rolling up my sleeves and doing a million jobs, and I find it really fun. But at the end of the day, you do want this to be a livelihood. And there's a certain, especially kind of with that bigger tent idea and trying to keep your wine prices low, there's all these factors that you're kind of weighing on the financial side of things. And I think, to be viable in California as a small business, I kind of feel like the 9,000 case mark at our price point with our sales channel model is about the minimum we could make. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges, to make natural wine. I think you actually probably need more personnel per gallon, I guess, of wine that you're making, because you do need to be so focused on tasting and smelling constantly. Our nose and our mouth is really better at detecting really, really early microbial activity than anything else.
Mm-hmm.
So.
So you mentioned American hybrids. This question says, where do you see those hybrids fitting into the natural wine market?
I think hybrids are very, very fascinating. I haven't worked with them myself. I have a few friends that do, but I mean, that whole long spiel I gave about powdery mildew. I mean, if we could get away from spraying our grapes, environmentally, financially, exposure to our labor force, chemicals exposure to our labor force, all these things would be incredible. So I know that, UC Davis has been doing some work on targeting, certain diseases and trying to breed for them. But I really think hybrids could really lend a big hand in helping us peel away from all of the kind of chemical farming that we're relying on with certain grape varieties. And I do feel like we're going to need to learn how to make the wine from them, though. Hybrids still have this reputation of being strange and foxy, and they're very, very acidic. And so what does that mean for wine? I mean, I still believe that there's no bad grape out there. We just need to learn where to plant it and how to make it. I think there's a big learning curve for us winemakers with hybrids.
Well, I certainly have a friend in Europe who's a chemist, like I am, and he's planted what he calls a no-spray vineyard. I mean, it's clear that, to be as sustainable as possible, you want to have a situation where you don't have to spray anything. Mm-hmm. But it's a challenge. I mean, vinifera, really, it's not feasible. So here's another question. This comes from a real fan who said, served your post flirtations at their wedding. Mm-hmm. They said, could you tell us about a moment in your business when your values have come into conflict?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a perfect example. So, in the definition of natural winemaking, and I mentioned this a little bit in the talk, there's this idea that things shouldn't be filtered at all. And when I was first making natural wine, I mean, and I came across a situation where I thought I was getting a Brettanomyces bloom in one of our fermentations. And I was debating whether, if that were the case, once I, figured out the results, whether there was actually Brett there, would I filter the wine? And I think I would. So I think that that's one of those things where it's like, it feels a little bit hard for me to say, yes, I champion natural wines. And yet, on occasion, I step outside of those boundaries, because I think it's hard for people to understand that, just because I put a foot out there doesn't mean that I'm moving my whole body out there, or that I'm taking, 5 steps. And I do think that it can be the case, but, you take one step and you say, well, we'll just, as we grow, we'll do X, Y, or Z thing. So I think really putting that transparency flag in the ground from day one is a great way to keep yourself in check. And I think any business should do that. What are their core values, and what's your North Star, and you need to stick to it. Or you need to tell your consumers when you're not going to stick to it and when you're going to pivot and what the reasoning is, because you might have a really great reason for it. It might have been something that, yes, you thought this was the right way, and then actually ends up that this way is a way that makes more sense for the sustainability of your business on a whole. So I don't know. I'm speaking in generalities, but yeah.
Okay, so here's a semi-technical question about vineyard operations. Do you feel, in a dry Mediterranean climate, do you feel copper can be totally eliminated from fungicides? And then how do you think, how can you manage a vineyard in a damper, wetter climate? Or have you thought about that?
Yeah, I mean, farming that Pinot vineyard in Sonoma County, I was just like, I can't be out here every 10 days. This seems insane. So I think there was already an overwintering presence of mildew that I was combating, which I do, but I do think, yes, copper. I've never used copper in our vineyards. Despite the fact that it's organic, I do feel, and we know this to be the case, that it is something that builds up in our soils and can be a problem over time. As far as, managing, doing more minimal intervention in wetter climates, for powdery, if you have a lot of water, you can actually like douse, rain actually decreases powdery mildew while humidity increases it. The raindrops can actually diminish it. So you could go ahead and, try to overhead irrigate. I don't know though, that could cause a whole bunch of other problems. I'm really at a loss here. I think honestly, it's about what you're growing. Try to get the least susceptible grape you can to the disease that's most common in your area, and then build your business model around it. I mean, we in the US have this, in all of our vineyard contracts, the standard is 3% or less MOG, which is material other than grapes. So that's kind of what our industry standard is set on. And I think it's part of the reason that organic farming is considered too risky, because we have such a low threshold for that. So I think from the get-go, try to understand, if I'm working organically or with minimal intervention, what is my loss going to be? Maybe I'm going to lose 10% of my crop each year, which is hard to swallow, but you really need to try to understand that from the get-go so you can price your bottles accordingly.
Here's a interesting question. Do you think that, so this is from someone who's not sold yet on natural wine.
Great.
Do you think one of the problems for the skepticism of this area is solely the use of the term natural, which by definition lumps all other wines into the unnatural variety? Is there an alternative term that the public might react to differently, and so on? So you get the gist of it.
Yeah, that's part of, honestly, the whole thing about natural wine having a somewhat fuzzy definition, I think is great. Because I feel like it's not a black and white thing where, okay, natural wines are natural and everything else is unnatural, whatever that means. And there are things in the cellar, like, if you're adding tartaric acid to your fermentation, it doesn't necessarily mean that's not coming from grapes initially, or I don't know, there's a whole bunch of examples. So I think it can be problematic. It's the word we have right now. Minimal intervention is also thrown out there, but again, I just really have to go back to this idea of elective transparency. And the more we educate consumers, the more consumers themselves can kind of weave their way through this information and say, oh yeah, I don't think it's a bad thing for me to drink wines that have tartaric acid added to them. That's, naturally grape, that's in all wines, tartaric acid. And so, or if they're saying, I really want only this thing that really reflects terroir and it's very important to me, then I'm not going to have wines that add that, to the wine. So anyway, I think it's problematic. I hope it has opened up a lot of discussion and education, as a potential silver lining. But yeah, until a different word comes along, again, it's kind of a collective movement that not one person can say, yeah, we're going to switch it right now. So.
Okay, Walt, it looks like Walt wanted to jump in on that. Walt, so
yeah, I know.
The use of the term.
Well, yeah, let me, well, first of all, thank you, Martha, for doing this. It's been great. The one word that I came around from your talk that applies not just to winemaking, but to a lot of other things you're doing is you've got incredible courage to let nature sort of drive the product style to a certain degree, and courage in your packaging, courage in your naming of wines in fairly non-traditional way. So I think congratulations on that. Yeah, the natural versus unnatural, it reminds me, you won't remember this because of our age differentials, when light wines, when it was still a jug wine business back in the 70s, and of course now these low alcohol wines are starting to come back, but everybody came out with light wines, which were 9% alcohol, didn't taste very good. And I was on the commercial side of the business, and we went out and talked to consumers, and the problem, I think the category never made it, is consumers, especially women, already considered wine light in the terms of low alcohol, low calories, whether they knew it scientifically or not, but that was a perception they had. So I came back to our marketing people and said, are we solving a problem the consumer doesn't have? And that's why I worry a little bit about the natural, because the flip side, as you say, is unnatural, but I don't know what the solution is. The last point, I really enjoyed the Asimov comments, and I know there's a lot of talk about the new generation, moving away from wine as opposed to the boomers, who were, sort of the first generation to get into wine. Hopefully it's not going to be that short of a success story. But one thing that perhaps natural wines can do is and this is a bit of a stretch, what the spirits are doing in creating these new cocktails, a new cocktail every, these young consumers don't really maybe have never heard of it, but they're so, oh, try it. And you get different taste profiles and things that it isn't your father's Manhattan. It's some concoction. And I'm not saying you're making a concoction, but offer experimentation and differentiation to this younger generation. And maybe that's one of the things natural wines can do, as opposed to, Chardonnay is either buttery or not buttery, or Cabernet is either highly tannic or not, where there's, if you're making traditional varietal wines, you have less differentiation. Anyway, that's just a thought. Maybe it's something that you can bring to this next generation of consumers, that you are offering a new opportunity to try new tastes that you haven't had before in traditional wines.
Yeah. I try to, I didn't necessarily in this talk, but I definitely try to drive that point home, and that, natural wine is really about expanding the flavor spectrum,
exactly,
rather than saying this or that. And again, I think, these kind of more, I guess, formulated wines, I think, do have a place on the market. Some people really want consistency over time. But I do think that we were kind of at a point in our California wine journey as an industry where, there's really big consolidation at the high end, and really a drive towards making kind of, I guess, financially safer wines and consistent wines. And I think at the expense of kind of showcasing some of the other things that California can do. So again, the idea is to really about, the kind of break down some of these categories and really expand the spectrum.
But you only need to get the category natural wines. If you get a 5% of the wine category, it'll be enormous relative to where it currently is. I mean, I don't know. It will be enormous.
It's still
so you're not talking about having to get a 50% market share.
Yeah. I joke. I mean, I'll joke about hippies aside. I really think the wine industry probably hasn't, tried to drill down into data on natural wine sales, is because we're really still very, very small.
Exactly.
So yeah, I'm curious to see where it goes in California, especially because, again, this whole David and Goliath thing about really large consolidation of the largest wineries in California, and then these really teeny little players. I mean, I'm kind of curious to see what happens if that middle ground ends up being filled back out.
Is a big brand like Bonterra, which is made from organic grapes, I guess, is their positioning. That's sort of is that a potential consumer opportunity, an entry point for people to say, well, at least I've gotten that far. Now I can take it another couple steps.
Totally, totally. I mean, I think of this again as like, I don't know. I often think of salad greens for some reason when I'm thinking of wine and trying to make an analogy or metaphor here. But I kind of think of this, the wine industry could potentially be like, maybe these natural wine players are like farmers markets and they really drive consumer interest towards better farming practices, ingredients that you really have to cook, based on their seasonality, and you have to improvise a little bit more in the kitchen from what you get at a farmer's market. I think the winemaking of natural wines that way. And then you kind of have this in-between area where, like Earthbound Organics is a huge producer of, they're the stuff, they're in every grocery store. They're organic, but they're salad greens in the kind of plastic shell. And that's a great step forward, I think, from, conventionally farmed lettuce. And, there's obviously a wide spectrum of farming practices within that conventional category. So, I think we're going to see, hopefully, natural wine and the interest there driving larger companies. Bonterra's been doing it for a while. Fetzer's been doing it for a while before natural wine even was a term, probably. So hopefully, yeah, you see what didn't Franzia make a made from organic grapes line recently? So I think all progress in that direction is good progress.
Okay. It's getting late.
Yeah.
And we still have many questions, which we're not going to get to. But I do want to give you one last question, which struck me. And that is, do you think UC Davis should offer a class on natural wine or natural winemaking?
So when I was at Davis, let's see, what point in my journey, I was drinking some natural wines. I was getting introduced to the category. I'd certainly worked at places that didn't add anything in the cellar. And I'd worked in places that had farmed organically or minimal, with minimal intervention. So I kind of feel like Davis did give me a natural wine education, because I felt like, I kind of learned what's the science behind wine, talking about, pH protecting your wine, or how a wine ages long-term, regardless of whether or how sulfur interacts with wine. So you can figure out how, if you're making a natural wine to age, you probably want tannins in it and you probably want acidity in it. So those sort of things are really, I think, accessible at UC Davis. I think a lot has changed since I graduated in 2012, and things, the needle continues to be pushed. But I personally would have liked to have seen more organic farming into the viticulture program. That was lacking for me when I was there.
I think the needle is moving.
Yeah.
So we are way over time, so I'm going to have to thank you both now for this wonderful discussion and very stimulating discussion about these different ideas related to natural wine. I'm sure the audience will go away with a much better appreciation of the subject. And also, Walt, thank you very much for your support of the lecture series, and thank you both for coming here tonight, taking the time to let us know what's going on here. Well, I'll move on then, and thank you both for coming.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank the RMI and the ATS staff for enabling our program and making sure you hear about it. We have a couple things coming up in March. We have a Savor program on terroir from the perspective of local beer. It should be a very interesting discussion. We just announced a forum program on plant-based meats for next month. And finally, I'd like to thank our friends of the RMI whose support makes these programs possible. And in closing then, thank you very much for attending. Please fill out the survey on your way out, and good night.